members from Peterson who are there as well. This is organized together with Princeton. And on Monday next week, we have geopolitics and international trade and finance, knowns and unknowns, that we organize together with the WHO. And the coming week, macro week, we have basically every bank governor in the world coming to Peterson. We have the Minister of Finance from Saudi Arabia on Monday. On Tuesday, we have the governor from Portugal, the Minister of Finance from Paraguay, the Finnish governor, and on Wednesday we have the deputy from the Banque de France, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, Liechtenstein's Prime Minister, and the Geneva report launch. And on Thursday we have the governor from Norway, and on Friday the governor from the Bank of India. So if you want to listen to all this, it's going to be very exciting. It's all here. You can sign up via the website. But today, we have the most exciting event of it all. We will discuss this book, Behind the Curve, by our own Robert Lawrence. There are more books outside if you didn't have time to take one. It's Behind the Curve, Can Manufacturing Still Provide Inclusive Growth? And this is a very interesting, timely, and in my view, very pedagogically written book about the manufacturing industry here in the US, but there's also comparison with other countries, and how that part of the labor force, but also of growth, have been declining. Why is that so? And how has that happened? And industrial policies, also very trendy right now, might not be the remedy to reverse the trend, but I will let Robert talk more about this. So we're going to go about like this, that Robert is going to present his book, and then afterward we will have two people commenting then, and then a discussion between us, and then it's open to the floor for you. So Robert is a non-resident fellow here at the Peterson Institute, and he's also the Albert L. Williams Professor of Trade and Investment at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And he has a long list of other accomplishments, also at the advisory board of the University of Witwatersrand School of Governance in Johannesburg in South Africa. We have Leila Aridi Afas, who is a strategic at Toyota, who advises the leadership there on geopolitical industries, on how to navigate changes. She has also been director of export promotion at the US Trade and Development Agency, and a lot of other things as well. And we have Jed Kolko, who was Undersecretary for Economic Affairs at the US Department of Commerce in the Biden-Harris administration. And he has also been chief economist at several places, at Indeed and at analytics, VP of Analytics at Trulia. It's an online real estate site. So I will start by giving the floor to Lawrence, and then we will let Leila comment, and then Jed. Please, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Cecilia, for your kind words. It's really a pleasure for me to finally present what has taken me an awfully long time to write. I won't take quite as long to present it, but I hope it leaves you with the kind of insights into structural change that I've gleaned while working on this book. Basically, there is a consensus in this town, and that is that US manufacturing jobs have fundamentally been destroyed by international trade. And American trade policy is blamed by and large for what's happened to the declining employment in the US economy. Others would point to the role of automation in that process. But it is an area in which what's striking is that both our candidates for the president seem to agree. And that is that manufacturing has declined because of errors in policy that have been made, and that the key to restoring the middle class of the United States is basically to restore manufacturing policy and the manufacturing sector. Now, of course, they don't quite agree on the policies. Donald Trump emphasizes a profound role for tariffs, and Kamala Harris is looking to provide subsidies to the tune of $100 billion, she says. And in a sense, we can see that both sides are using these policies, but they reflect a deep view that the plight of especially American men who have not gotten a college education and have done so poorly in the US economy over the past 5 decades, where their wages have barely risen, and the many left behind places in the United States can be attributed to what's happened to the manufacturing sector, and the solution is to restore the vitality of that sector. Now, my book challenges these views. I believe that both the explanations for why manufacturing employment has fallen over time and the looking to manufacturing as a solution to restoring the opportunities for workers without college degrees and left behind places is fundamentally misplaced, because it reflects a failure to understand the structural features of actually all economies as they develop. And so why this book has the strange title, which is Behind the Curve, reflects the insights that I obtained by working through the literature on structural change. If you want to explain how the structure of an economy evolves, you need to integrate 3 fundamental drivers. The first is the different productivity growth that is characteristic of agriculture, of manufacturing, and of services. And you need as well to add in the role that demand plays in changing the structure of the economy. And what I do in the first part of the book is to lay out a theoretical framework backed by those of you who thus inclined by an appendix, which is on, not in the book, but on the web, which lays out a mathematical model that essentially demonstrates what I am going to say. Fundamentally, everybody knows that as economies grow, the share of agriculture falls. Equally widely recognized is that economies get richer, the share of services rises. But what happens to the share of manufacturing employment? Well, it turns out manufacturing follows a hump, an inverted U. When countries begin to develop, the share of manufacturing employment rises. After that, it reaches a peak and then declines. And almost every major industrial economy has passed its peak, and many developing countries have passed their peaks. And so what the first part of the book does is to lay out this theory, show how pervasive the phenomenon of this curve is, and argue that it is inevitable that manufacturing will tend to, when it comes to employment, provide a less and less important role in the economy. When it comes to output, it lags, but there is nonetheless still a curve. And that if you go around the world, what you find is individual countries all think they understand their problems when it comes to manufacturing. And what they fail to realize is that they're sharing in a common structural change. So what you notice here is the inverted U. This is 200 years of data for the United States. And what I've run is the period since 1965 in which the share of manufacturing employment in the United States has fallen. But if you take data on the share of manufacturing employment and you plot it against income, and you use a global sample, here I have 42 different countries, what you notice is there's a curve. If you separate, you can look at the developed countries, and you can see that most of them are on the right-hand side of the curve. If you look at developing countries, you'll see they're on the left. And if you look at different regions, you'll find the econometrics wants to fit a curve, and it fits a curve to Africa, to Asia, to Latin America, and to Europe. So this is pervasive evidence. And here is China. And what you'll see is that somewhere around 2013, the Chinese peaked at 19.3% of employment, a level much lower, by the way, and this is discussed in the book in quite detail, but I won't talk about it today, at a level much lower than today's industrial economies were able to achieve when they reached their peak. This is a phenomenon which has been called premature deindustrialization. So it is increasingly difficult for latecomers to achieve these levels. Now, why is there a hump? Well, a simple theory, and there are more complicated ones in the book, is to start by thinking about productivity growth. And here I show you productivity relative to GDP in the United States. And here I show you what happens to the price of manufactured goods compared to prices in the rest of the economy. Inverted. So just to confuse you, it means that when this red line goes up, the prices of manufactured goods are going down. And what you can see is that basically relative prices reflect relative productivity growth. So when an economy is in its early stages of development, agriculture tends to have rapid productivity growth. That means that the prices of agricultural goods fall. However, what most people don't appreciate is that this is a major driver of their manufacturing employment growth. It's a positive force because people don't spend all the money they save from the lower prices, and they take that money and they spend it on manufactured goods and on services. In addition, it also turns out that at different levels of income, people tend to buy different mixes of goods and services. Poor people, they need shoes, they need clothes, they need bicycles. Rich people, they need psychiatrists, they need tax accountants, they need personal trainers. And so and you can see it very clearly, two interesting points. The poorest spend the highest shares on goods, and that's why international trade is so important. And the richest spend lower shares. But notice also for all groups, spending on consumption of goods has been declining steadily over time. People no longer spend as much money. In the US, in the 60s, we were spending half of all our consumption on goods. Now, because they're cheaper and our tastes are different at higher incomes, we're spending 30%. And then there's also something that would be surprising, and that is that it doesn't, once you're past the hump, it doesn't make much difference whether your country has a trade deficit or a trade surplus. Here's a sample of 60 countries, and it shows what happened between 1995 and 2011. And what I demonstrate is that the decline in the change in manufacturing employment share in the surplus countries was 4.39% a year, and the decline in the deficit countries was a little bit smaller, 3.78%. So surplus or deficit, you'll still have the curve winning in the end. And if you're on the downward slope, it's going to be declining. Take a look at those dynamic Asian economies who enjoyed export-led growth, and what you'll see, this is Japan is the blue, Korea is the red, Malaysia is a lighter blue, Singapore, all of them have a share of manufacturing that has followed this humped shape. The second part of the book then says, okay, so this is the structural change. What does it actually imply for inclusion? And I make the distinction between inclusion and inequality. Inequality is a problem, no question, when poor people have much fewer resources than rich people. But take a significant segment of your economy and exclude that segment from growth, and you're likely to also have a problem. And that's a big problem that we've had in the United States. In the early period, that's until about the mid-70s, manufacturing was an important source of overall output and productivity growth. And this enhanced the inclusion of workers, especially those who were less educated, and it gave them a path to the middle class. It also, as I found out doing the research, allowed regions of the country that were behind to attract manufacturing firms to come and invest, and in effect, in the US, they moved heavily into the South. And what you find during this period is it's not only growing equality across individuals, but there's growing equality across places. And of course, it also strengthened the role of nationwide unions that gave workers greater influence and benefits and other policies. But manufacturing's role has fundamentally changed. The employment share has shrunk steadily since the 1970s, long before, by the way, people knew about the WTO, people knew about NAFTA. All of these trends occurred much later, but we can look back and see the declines. In 60 to 69, 30% of American growth came from manufacturing, and roughly the same was the share of non-farm employment in manufacturing. Between 2010 and 2019, 10% of US growth was in manufacturing, and when you put the denominator as non-farm employment, it's about 8.7%. And we've also seen the convergence of the regions is no longer a characteristic of our economy. We're divided into superstar cities on the one hand and left behind places on the other. So this simply demonstrates that the incomes of non-college workers have effectively measured in 2019 dollars remained flat for almost 5 decades. Now, they're earning, the median of these workers is earning about $40,000 a year. And that's the same as his counterpart was earning 5 decades earlier. That, to me, epitomizes non-inclusive growth. And if you want to understand populism and you want to understand the despair in these places, it's very important to recognize this phenomenon. Between 2000 and 2010, we had a long period of declining shares in manufacturing. But in that decade, the United States lost 5.8 million jobs in manufacturing. Now, the famous study by Otto, Dorn, and Hansen, who came up with the number of how many jobs had been lost due to the China shock, they concluded just under 1 million. In other words, 16% of the explanation could be derived from the China shock. And that isn't the net effect of trade, because after all, we had exports as well that were creating jobs. And Robert Veenstra has done interesting work where he looks at both sides of of trade. And I think a fair number would be maybe 10% of this decline that you experienced during that period. Instead, totally lacking in the discussion of what happened in that period is any reference to the fact that we had 2 recessions over that decade. We had the bursting of the dot-com bubble, we had the global financial crisis, and I find when you integrate what you would have expected, given the growth rate in demand, you basically see that the dominant reasons for that decline, once you've taken out that 10% for trade, reflect faster productivity growth in manufacturing on the one side, and what's never spoken about, sluggish demand growth. And that's in combination why we experience that decline. I'll try to speed up. Will trade and industrial policies promote inclusive growth? So what I do is to go through the current industrial policies. I use the United States as a test case. I invite all of you to get a copy of one of the chapters in the book that has been updated and is released today as a working paper. And it examines the question of whether or not what we've seen in the US so far can be talked about as an industrial renaissance. And my conclusion is that, in fact, manufacturing has not thus far shown any signs of renaissance, that if you look at employment, which is that blue line, you can see because of COVID, we experienced a big decline in manufacturing employment and employment in general. We then had a rapid recovery for a couple of years, but for the past 2 years, in effect, manufacturing employment has been flat, while the rest of employment has continued to grow. So manufacturing is indeed, despite the tariff protection we've imposed, the industrial policies we've launched, manufacturing remains experiencing slow growth, not only in employment, but also in output. Now, I do acknowledge that perhaps things are going to get a little different. There have been these major industrial policies which have been implemented. There is a lot of evidence of a big increase in construction investment. And so perhaps something good is going to happen to manufacturing, or something positive is going to happen to manufacturing employment down the line. So what I've done, the White House has tabulated all these announcements that have been made by firms who intend to build and the places where they intend to build. And what I do is to estimate what will be the job impacts of these announced investments. And what I conclude is, from one point of view, they're pretty significant, probably increase the demand on the demand side for workers by 1.7 million. That sounds like a lot. It's a 13.3% increase in manufacturing employment over its 2022 levels. But actually it amounts to 1%, just over 1% of the American workforce. So the bottom line here is that while industrial policies may well be important for goals and for making the hardware that we need for digitization, for decarbonization in our economy, and indeed for national security, manufacturing can no longer provide the demand for workers, nor the opportunities for inclusive growth that it did in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for that excellent overview of your book. And I'm absolutely delighted to serve as a discussant for what can truly be called Robert's magnum opus on manufacturing employment and representing one of the world's largest manufacturing companies. It's really an honor to provide our point of view on this. And I just want to be clear that it's actually my point of view that I'm going to be sharing today. And I'd like to just briefly go over the points that really struck me in Robert's book. Again, provide that manufacturing point of view, and then also share what I believe that means moving forward. So Robert laid out sort of the key findings, and really I have to applaud the grounded research to inform decision-making among policymakers, and I hope that many of them read what you have put forward. But the first thing is he talks about this inverted U. And again, it's due to structural forces beyond any one thing, and it's whether it's rich economies or developing countries. And so the key takeaway is it's not going to be one tool to address it. And Robert wisely reminds us of the Tinbergen principle, right? That you can't, you one tool per policy, right? There's no Swiss Army knife in the economic policy toolkit that we can use. And therefore, if we want to focus on decarbonization, or we want to protect national security, or we want to preserve manufacturing jobs, we need to deploy many different approaches to do that, and then see what the synergies are to make that effective. The second thing that really struck me was Robert highlighted the fact that in the United States, it's less than 0.1% of GDP that goes towards worker assistance or training assistance programs to help them through these shocks or these transitions that we're seeing. That is far less than the 0.5% that we see in other OECD economies. And I could say that's a 5x increase, but they're still very, very marginal. And he also goes into detail to describing what types of assistance programs are most effective. And one of them is the ability to help workers relocate. And we lived through this, right, with the financial crisis. And we saw a lot of the Gulf Coast oil workers, right, they lost their jobs, but they were not able to pack up and go to the oil shale fields in North Dakota in order to take advantage of those employment opportunities, because many of them were underwater in their mortgages, right, had family commitments, many times elderly parents or children that they had to take care of, that kept them connected to their community. So being able to help workers go to where the jobs are is really key, in addition to ensuring that they have health benefits for themselves and for their families when they do have a gap in employment, and of course, making sure that as they transition, and maybe they were a skilled trade worker on a manufacturing line, but as they transition to maybe a digitalized career, they're lower on the totem pole and therefore not quite earning as much, that they're compensated for that gap, right, until they can climb the ladder in their new role. And the third thing that really struck me, and again, coming as someone who spent much of my career working in developing and middle-income countries, is that hope is not lost for countries that are just emerging on the economic scene. We hear a lot about how, Matt, the decline of manufacturing worldwide, and what does that mean for economies that are just about to clutch that bottom rung of the economic ladder when it's being pulled away from them, right? And he talks about that's not necessarily the case. Although we see this premature deindustrialization happen, especially for countries that are coming into the manufacturing ecosystem later, they kind of hit that that peak, and then that descension earlier than advanced economies did. They have new opportunities, and he highlights particularly 3D printing, and the study that was done by Carolyn Freund while she was here on the hearing aids, right, and being able to do that and provide other inputs into manufacturing or localizing production into their market. He also talks about digitalization, and what that means is they have the opportunity to connect to broadband and all these other opportunities in order to take advantage of services. Like you talked about therapy, well, there is teletherapy. So maybe your teletherapist is now in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, right? And I think this is where there's many opportunities, and so we can be hopeful. And that is one thing I think overall that I really appreciated about your work, Robert, is the optimistic tone. We hear so much doom and gloom about where we're headed and what it means, especially for less educated workers. And you really reorient us to think about what are the opportunities. And so I'd like to transition now to what that means for a manufacturing company. And I think first there's 3 principles that we are responsible for following, and that is technological advancement, transparency, and transition support. Now, in technological advancement, companies are, I think it's their obligation to, in the spirit of Kaizen or continuous improvement, continuously improve, meaning to continue to innovate and achieve technological advancement. And that, of course, enables us, speaking on behalf of Toyota, to make our vehicles safer, smarter, and more sustainable. And that is exactly what we owe society to do. However, those changes will have implications. And that leads me to my second sort of principle, which is transparency. I think industry has to be transparent about when they're seeing stark technological shifts and what that means for jobs, what that means for how things work. We have to be very clear about how these will impact production, people, and places, right? And then that leads me to my final principle, and that is really transition support and what we can do to sort of aid that shift. And Robert, of course, highlights the German apprenticeship model in his book, and I would like to actually highlight apprenticeship model that Toyota launched here in the US, and it's a uniquely American apprenticeship model. It is not based on something that Toyota launched in Japan. And they actually created it in 2010 in Kentucky. Believe it or not, our largest plant in the entire world is in Georgetown, Kentucky. And working in collaboration with Bluegrass Technical Community College, Toyota launched this apprenticeship training program where students could earn while they learn, where they spend a few days in the classroom and then they spend a few days on the line. Because one thing that we found, as many manufacturing companies have found, is that the equipment that's in the classroom is outdated. Right, and it's a huge capital cost. You can't necessarily expect a community college to maintain it to the latest cutting edge standards. So many times when people would earn certificates or associate's degrees and they came to work on the line, they had no idea how to actually operate the equipment. And so this program, which again was launched in 2010, was so successful and grew so rapidly. And it was based on this community mindset where Toyota recognized that we all benefit from having a skilled workforce. So even if you graduate from this program and you don't go to work for Toyota, you go to work for Ford, or you go to work for maybe a manufacturer of refrigerators or drying machines, that's fine because we all benefit from this. And so I'm proud to say that the Manufacturing Institute actually took this over and made it into a nationwide program called FAME. And to date, there are 450 different manufacturing companies that participate in FAME and use these workers. And I checked right before coming here today, and to date, 85% of the graduates of this program receive full-time employment with the manufacturing firms that they work with. And that leads me to sort of my final thoughts. And Robert really does an excellent job of describing how and why we are behind the curve. And although we couldn't possibly expect him to come up with all the answers, he does at least ask the right questions to help us get ahead of it. And I think it really does behoove us to rethink sort of the social contract of what we owe each other. And that includes industry and what we can do. Because as people feel the ground shifting, we have to make sure that they don't fall through the cracks. And what is it that we can do working together? Because quite frankly, these challenges are too great. Again, the structural forces at play, whether it's geopolitical, as we all know all too well, given the current landscape today, whether it's demographic, whether it's economic, all these different forces, it's too much of a challenge for governments to face alone. We need to collaborate together, including with industry, with academia, with think tanks, and with civil society in order to find the path forward and to ensure inclusive growth for all. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I want to thank both Leila and Robert for your presentations already, and thank you for including me here today. And I'm going to echo that caveat that even though I did, I left government a few months ago, of course I'm speaking only for myself, but I am really speaking only for myself. I have a few remarks thinking about manufacturing, jobs, and industrial policy. And I want to take this in three very short parts. The first is, the first point I want to make is basically some amplifications and also some questions. I want to begin just by saying I agree with the main point of the book, of the research, that the primary reason for the decline that we see in manufacturing share of employment is productivity and technology change, not trade, and also that public sector investment in manufacturing, even significant public sector investment in manufacturing, is unlikely to meaningfully increase manufacturing share of employment. I actually want to pile on a bit to this sort of main point. It's also the case that if you look at projections, what are the high wage jobs likely to grow that offer the most opportunity but are entry-level jobs, they are no longer in manufacturing. They're in construction, they're in healthcare, they're in installation repair, they're in a range of other sectors, but not manufacturing. The second pile-on point is when we look at the regional level and the places that have really made economic transformations over the past 40 years. Charlotte, Pittsburgh, Northwest Arkansas, the Provo-Orem, Utah area, none of them were driven by manufacturing growth. All driven by some kind of service industry, either finance or tech, or transitions away from manufacturing. And so we even see that at the local level, and it's very hard to point to local economies that have seen a manufacturing-led transition. The other pile-on point I want to make is that even within manufacturing, manufacturing jobs are not what they used to be. One of the most striking trends to me is that the share of jobs in manufacturing industries that are actually production jobs, so share of manufacturing industry jobs that are manufacturing occupations has declined from about 72% to 51%. Half of jobs in the manufacturing industry today are not manufacturing occupations. They are various service occupations, support occupations, business functions, and so on. And so even if we believe that there is something special about manufacturing jobs in an occupational sense, the changes in manufacturing make those harder to grasp. And it also means that from a labor market perspective, the decline in manufacturing share of jobs is even steeper when you think about it as manufacturing occupations rather than the manufacturing industries. So those are my amplifications of Robert's main points. I also have two questions, and these are genuine questions. These are not passive-aggressive disagreements that I'm phrasing as questions. These are like real questions. The first is, I would love to hear a bit more about how we think about changing demand and how that changes the sort of demand for manufactured goods. And in particular, there has been this trend in the pandemic where there's been a shift back in nominal terms in consumer spending towards goods. So if you look at the gold line here, there's been this little bump up since 2020 in the share of consumer spending going to goods. It has fallen back down slightly, but still slightly above where it was pre-pandemic. In real terms, given that goods prices have risen so much less than services prices, there's actually been a slow but persistent rise in the share of consumer spending on goods if you measure this all in real terms. Granting, of course, that you shouldn't actually do this technically because of chained prices. Apologies if you care about this sort of thing. But the bigger point is, does the composition of demand matter also when we think about broader trends in manufacturing, or is it really just a sort of high-level demand question? So those are my two genuine questions to get to. Sorry, that's the first genuine question. The second genuine question is, what other sectors should we group together with manufacturing as we think about these trends? Do we think about construction in the same way as no longer a source of good inclusive jobs? As a labor economist, I naturally group construction and installation and repair together with manufacturing, but that perhaps sounds like heresy to a trade economist because I am grouping together non-tradables with tradable sectors. So I'm curious, to what extent does the broad argument for manufacturing carry over for adjacent sectors? And you may have a different view of what are the adjacent sectors than I do. My second broad point is in thinking about policy and even our understanding of the economy, the manufacturing sector is simultaneously too broad to be useful and also kind of too narrow to be useful. And here's what I mean by this. Too broad to be useful in that when we are making arguments around national economic security, for industrial policy, for investing in particular sectors, of course this does not apply to manufacturing across the board. We need to be thinking about the specific manufacturing industries. It does not include, say, footwear or toys. And so even thinking about the manufacturing sector as a policy construct is in many ways too broad. It is also at the same time, though, too narrow. So suppose your goal was to boost manufacturing. There are probably policies that are not specific to manufacturing that should be high on the list of things you might do. We haven't talked much about the labor supply side, but of course, the foreign-born workforce is significant in the economy overall, 17% of workers overall, 19% of manufacturing, and significantly more in some manufacturing industries, including several technical industries, those that require a lot of education, such as electronic components and computer and peripheral electronic manufacturing. So one kind of policy that you might think about to boost manufacturing activity and employment is a policy that has nothing to do with manufacturing per se, and in fact is a policy that would boost employment across many sectors. In a sense, as you think about immigration as a policy that helps boost manufacturing, thinking about manufacturing alone is too narrow. Another way of thinking that manufacturing is too narrow is to extend the argument that part of what is behind the decline in manufacturing share of employment is growing relative productivity in manufacturing. You might think that, if you wanted to help manufacturing, boost services productivity. And the changes in productivity in recent years in sectors outside of manufacturing have been dramatically lower, in some cases negative. Construction, educational, and health services have actually had negative labor productivity in the 35 years until roughly now. And so, if the goal is to help manufacturing, either as output or even as employment, thinking about manufacturing in some ways may be too narrow, because the policies that could be most helpful for manufacturing might not be manufacturing policies per se. So jumping somewhat laterally to one last short point, just because Robert's book is such a nice discussion, both of industrial policy and an argument in favor of place-based policies, I wanted to say just a couple words about what has happened in place-based policies in this administration, something I've been involved with. There's been a resurgence in place-based policies, policies designed to direct investments or boost outcomes in particular localities. I think there are, broadly speaking, three reasons for this. One, economic arguments, growing inequality, declining geographic mobility, increasing unaffordability of some of the most productive places. And that has been a trend that's been going on since about 1980. Second, I think there's a political imperative, as partisanship has been increasingly correlated with local education levels, economic outcomes. It means that place-based policies are one of the relatively few kinds of redistributive policies for which there is bipartisan support. So I think that's a second reason. I think a third reason is place-based policies have, in a sense, ridden the coattails of industrial policy. Often when you think of industrial policy, if you are investing in particular companies or sectors, you are doing that in a particular place. And you can either leave that to the political process or make it random, or you could be thoughtful about which are the kinds of places that will do the best job at converting the marginal dollar of federal investment into whatever the desired outcome is. So I think this is all behind the motivation for place-based policy. And I just want to end with one way of thinking about all these place-based policies, and that is there really are two different types. There are those that are designed to help the neediest places, targeting the places that are most distressed. Then there's a separate set that's really more focused on some of the industrial policy questions of how to basically maximize federal investments for some sort of national goal, improving our technological capacity, economic security, fighting climate change, so on. These are different, and to get back to Leila quoting Robert quoting Tinbergen on policies and instruments, the current schema of place-based policies does a pretty good job at not trying to lump together too many goals. One advantage of having such a decentralized federal government is you've got these place-based policies scattered in a lot of different departments and agencies, often with a fairly specific focus. We do not have one policy of geographic redistribution that is both trying to help the neediest places and take advantage of the highest asset places. In that sense, our decentralization compared to Europe's regional policy, the EU's regional policy, is an advantage. And so I just wanted to end on this sort of encouraging note, echoing the enthusiasm in Robert's book for place-based policies as distinct from industrial policy. Thanks very much.
much. Had the perspectives from the business community. Sorry for not pronouncing your name wrongly before, and from Jed, the more policy administration point of view. And there were some questions there as well. Do you want to spend a few minutes on commenting them?
Yes, well, so I really appreciated both. I was delighted that they brought out that the book isn't simply the structural analysis, but there are these chapters which do give policy recommendations. And the broad thrust is to move away from narrow focuses on only those people displaced by trade or only particular areas that are in trouble because of certain policies towards broadly based structural adjustment policies. And I think this is a fundamental weakness in the United States. As Leila quoted some of the numbers we spend on retraining, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. And here I guess I would differ slightly with Jed. I do like his distinction between having policies that try to zero in on the neediest communities and place-based policies which try to achieve particular objectives of the programs. That's true. But my reading of the evidence is we've done a lot more of the latter. We tend to take care of the places in the context of the industrial policies. And I do think here we run into Tinbergen's problem. So, for instance, in the CHIPS Act, provision is made that we should have regional R&D centers. We need 10 of them. Well, I find myself asking, is that going to give us the best research? It may help certain places, and you know, Simon Johnson won the Nobel Prize the other day, and he thinks it could reignite communities, but I don't like that as a community policy. In fossil fuels, we have a policy which is trying to turn energy hubs that depended on fossil fuels into energy hubs that depend on renewables. Well, is that the best approach? Each community may well have very different needs. And I was really struck when he gave these examples of how communities have found their own way to redevelop once they've been hit by shocks. I think the reason that we integrate these place-based policies in our programs is political. It's very hard to get a congressperson to vote unless you can somehow prove that the program is going to bring jobs in their district. And this leads to a conflation of these two goals, and I think it was very useful. I appreciate it, and I'll just end off here so we can have at least a couple of questions. I really appreciated Leila's pointing out that as we look to the future, and in particular the prospects for developing countries, those who see these technological trends as purely negative and labor displacing are overlooking a huge number of opportunities that are likely to arise. You know, who knows which way AI will work? I don't think anyone has a clue as yet. But I could see it just as well helping many developing countries compensate for some of their weaknesses currently as I can for them, their current activities being displaced.
Thank you very much. Well, it's certainly thought-provoking, and there's a lot of questions that could be asked, but we only have a couple of minutes, so please, gentlemen there, you can introduce yourself. And then Martin.
HK Radio in Hong Kong. What explains the peak What was happening in 2013 in China that made that the peak of the hump? What was it in Germany, Europe, or the United States?
I don't know. I haven't tried to answer that question. But but there are certain forces that cause manufacturing to rise. There are other forces that cause it to decline. If you get a peak, it suddenly means that the positive forces are going to be outweighed by the negative forces. The positive force that I see is twofold. One comes strongly in countries from agricultural productivity being rapid, and that was true, but I don't want to pin myself down to say that was what was the cause in China, but that's the positive force, the spillovers of demand for manufactured goods. The negative force is the productivity growth within manufacturing. And then overladen on that is trade. Small countries when they're small, are price takers in world markets. So they can sell as much as they can as long as they can produce the product. But over time, as they get bigger and bigger in the marketplace, there will be a declining, there will be some responsiveness to the quantity that they're throwing onto the market. And that is going to cause a diminution in the job creation that comes as a result of international trade. So it's a complex set of forces. It occurs at different times in different countries. And I haven't done the detailed work that would be required to give you a precise answer.
Martin Trozempa, Peterson Institute. Fantastic presentation. I'm curious what your analysis implies for the future of unions in the United States. If we're looking at unions in manufacturing area, it seems structurally, no matter how hard, say, dock workers could fight to try and stop automation, that jobs are going to decline. And one could imagine that unions would be the perfect kind of institution to do some of what you recommend, which is make sure that workers get resources as structural changes maybe reduce employment, but increase productivity and benefit the companies, that they would be able to help that adaptation. But at the same time, they don't have an incentive to retrain workers to go off and go somewhere else where they're not part of that union anymore or paying those dues. So how do you think about whether unions can be, how to maybe have the most positive role that unions can do in this adaptation required?
We'll take Jennifer's question as well, if you don't mind. So
Sure.
for the sake of time, Jennifer Hillman,
Hi,
please.
thank you. Jennifer Hillman from Georgetown Law School and the Center on Inclusive Trade and Development. I'm curious whether, I mean, if you step back and look at the political rhetoric and a lot of the other rhetoric that we're hearing, at least here in the United States, it seems to presume that a manufacturing job is worth more than any other job. And if you step back from it, at least from my perception, and peel away why is that, it is, for whatever reason, a perception that a genuine manufacturing job, and I really do appreciate that notion of, I mean, really like being on the assembly line, is this notion that it creates a stronger sense of community. That you have, if you will, stood and sweat next to your fellow worker, that your kids play on the same baseball team, whatever it may be, that it's not just the job, but it is this other important dimension of community. And I'm just curious whether this is just purely rose-colored glasses sort of myth building by those that use that kind of rhetoric, or whether there is anything to this notion that community is also to be valued, and therefore, you know, is there anything to suggest that a hardcore manufacturing job creates more community than a service job or some other job?
I have a new book.
Okay.
Right there.
Well, let me start with the second question. Actually, there is an answer in the book which surveys a little of the research. Manufacturing does pay premium wages on the order of 13% if you control for education. Now, the puzzle is why, and yours is one interpretation. Maybe it's as a group they are especially productive because of teamwork or something like that. My suspicion is, though, that there are a lot of skills that aren't captured in formal education and are required in manufacturing. So the workers are actually pretty skilled in what they're being, or what they can do in manufacturing, and that sort of helps explain the premium. But it's a good topic for a dissertation. Unions have had trouble organizing outside of manufacturing, although they do well in mining. They essentially, my analysis is, they do well where they can hold production hostage. In a sense, it's a power battle. And you see it in government. So the government unions in the United States account for, I think, roughly half of all unions. You do see it in certain service sector activities. So we do have service unions, but it's much more difficult to find those opportunities. I also think, though, that legislation and rules under which unions have to operate are very important. By the way, I remember when Ronald Reagan took his major action against unions, it was against the air traffic controllers, not a manufacturing sector. So I think unions are part of the story. I think definitely, as was referred to earlier by Leila, the importance of collaboration between workers, between NGOs, with government and business are all critical in establishing community development activities. And it's these linkages where I think government has a key role to play in bringing these actors together, because successful adaptation is going to require activity on behalf of all of them.
You had some comments to this, Jed, and maybe Leila?
Yeah, sorry, just super quick, in response to Jennifer's super intriguing question that I'm gonna be unable to stop thinking about for a while, about manufacturing jobs and community. I guess I would want to control for two other factors to try to understand if it's true, assuming if it is true, why it is that manufacturing jobs seem to perhaps create more of a community. One is, I'd want to think about like average tenure of workers in different jobs or companies or sectors. I could easily imagine a long tenure effect contributing to a sense of community that is not necessarily about manufacturing per se. The other is that we know that the most geographically concentrated industries traditionally have been manufacturing industries, some like extremely so, carpet tufting, costume jewelry, and so on. And so again, I wonder if that is perhaps not so much a manufacturing effect per se, but rather a geographic concentration of an industry effect that contributes to the sense of community, again, suggesting that it may not be something inherent to or unique to manufacturing.
Yeah, so one thing Toyota strongly encourages those of us who work in the corporate arm to do is to work on the line for at least a couple of weeks, or literally elbow to elbow. And the belief is we can't truly represent the company until we understand the people who actually build the product that makes us so successful. And I can't emphasize enough how it really is this team spirit. And it provides not just a sense, not just a livelihood, not just a way to provide for yourself and your family, but an identity, right? A team to fight for. And you build something. I'd always worked in services, starting in banking and in consulting and government. And part of what lured me into Toyota was I really wanted to work for a manufacturing company to say, we make this. And it's something you can touch. It's something tangible. And every time a car rolls off the line, you feel the sense of just pride that we built that. And the other thing I'd emphasize, I wanted to draw the point, you talked about the peak in 2013, coming out of the financial crisis, and I know about this more from my prior role before I joined Toyota. There was a huge effort across companies to focus on cost savings, and they invested heavily in innovation, and a lot of that was automation. And not just in the US, but across. And so that peak was really them moving a lot of a lot of their production to automated production, driven by multiple factors, including safety and other things, but that was one of the drivers. And then the final point, Robert brought up that the skills that you have are beyond, that sometimes aren't captured necessarily in what you would quantify with a degree. And I just wanted to emphasize, as we're hearing a lot in the press lately about quality issues with certain manufacturers, I think if you look at a lot of the decisions that were made during the COVID pandemic and laying off workers who were more expensive, they were also more seasoned. And they were the ones that you may have your checklist of quality or other things that you need to look at before you have a product roll off the line or whatever you're building. But what those people did was way above and beyond what was on that checklist. They almost had a sixth sense about it. That doesn't look right. And by losing them, sorry for the feedback, guys, you lost that. And now we're seeing the repercussions of that. And so really, I will tell you, within our company, and they really, it's a value that they stay and they put their money where their mouth is. Their team members are the greatest asset. It's considered the greatest asset that they have, which is why during the financial crisis, when many other companies laid off workers, Toyota didn't. They did an across the board salary cut for everybody, especially the top of the pyramid. But they sent people out to the community. And they did projects throughout the community, and they also looked at their jobs and said, we can't build cars right now because nobody's buying them. But if you were to step back and look, how could we innovate this process? What do you think we should do differently? What's this? And it actually led to a lot of innovation that were incorporated and allowed the company to come back very strong when the economy started to recover. And I will go on mute to avoid that noise.
Final words?
Well,
We're at the hour, unfortunately. And
yes, so I think we're out of time.
Yeah.
I can't resist just one comment, because I was asked the question by Jed about construction. By the way, so a lot of the projects which the administration has launched, especially infrastructure, but others as well, are going to create a large number of construction jobs. And construction is an industry which has exactly the characteristics that we thought of as being present in manufacturing. It pays a premium wage, it is highly unionized, but what he also showed us, what's so striking, is that for the last 50 years, apparently, according to the data, there's been no productivity improvements in construction. So it's not typical of manufacturing in general, and maybe that's why those jobs have survived. However, they'll be temporary. Once the plants are installed, what will really matter for the medium and long term are the remaining jobs of those who remain in these industries.
Thank you so much, Robert, for writing this book and for sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you, Leila. Thank you, Jed. Thank you all for coming. If policymakers read your book, maybe they will do industrial policy slightly differently, so we can meet again in 2 years when they've all read it and see what happens then. And we can also follow up on construction. So thank you very much for attending the Peterson Institute seminar today.